welcome everyone to the Squared Ring podcast. Normally Nate does our introductions, but tonight we have a special guest. As you can see, our fourth screen is lit up with Mr. Herb Simmons. Most people call him the living legend, call him the last of the Mohicans, even the godfather of wrestling. So, how are you doing, Mr. Herb?
Well, first of all, I've been called a lot worse than that. So, but I appreciate all of that. I'm doing good. How about you guys?
I'm good. Busy day today. Not quite as busy as yours from the sounds of it, but pretty busy.
Yeah, good. And Jim, I know how busy you were.
Right. On that introduction, I just got to point this out there. So, other promoters call you the Godfather. The Kevin Sullivan calls you the last of the Mohicans. How does that make you feel that other promoters and wrestling legends think so highly of you?
Well, it really makes me feel old. But again, when you get the legends, Kevin Sullivan, guys like that I've known a long time and worked with, it's a matter of respect. And I learned that early on from Sam Muchnick and Larry Matisek and Bruiser Brody. I don't know if you can see them. They're on my wall back there, in fact. Those are the three gentlemen that I owe everything to. 50 years this past February. And it's been a ride that some people can only dream about. And when you tell wrestlers follow that dream and you'll catch it someday, well, I followed my dream and I caught it for 50 years. And how long it will be, I have no idea. If it ends today, I have no regrets whatsoever because I've met all those guys, the Kevin Sullivans and the list of the names that we got coming in May. And, you guys have been a big part of that. It's just not me. I tell everybody there's no I in the word team. And without the good guys in the locker room like you and Bobby and Gary and Texan and Attila and, and the list just goes on and on. Steve Fender and, it's you guys that are the ones that are going out there busting your butts each and every match and giving the fans what they want to see.
Well, I do agree, but I have to throw in a disagree part. Me and Bobby's worked for other promoters, other promotions, but yours seems the more professional. So even if we go out and bust our ass, it's not the same as busting our ass for SICW.
It's like you're held to a higher standard, both in the locker room, out there in the ring. Like it's not like anybody can just do it when you're there.
Right. So what we're trying to say is a lot of this has to do with you, Herb. It's the way you run your promotion. It's the way you run the business.
Well, and I appreciate that, and I really do. And you guys have been around me long, especially you two. You guys have been around a long time. And when I look at the guys, you're almost that. You guys are those local legends. The only difference between you and the guys that we call the legends is, the Kevin Sullivans and the J.J. Dillons and all of those guys. They were fortunate and came along in their life at a time when the business was a lot better than what it was now, more territories. Larry and I always talked about guys like you, Ron Powers, Attila Khan, Gary Jackson, just never got that break, never got that foot in the door. If you'd have got your foot in the door, we'd have been sitting here, Nate, tonight with two of those living legends that are just known around the country. They was just a little bit late on getting that because, when the territories kind of dried up, those type of opportunities dried up with it. So, and that's why I try to give back as much as I can to guys like you and everybody else in the locker room. The professionalism, I think, is just something that, I always was told by Sam, if you carry yourself good, you respect the boys, they'll respect you. And believe me, I get people come up to me at those matches and say, Herb, why you got a tie on tonight? You know, I mean, you guys can probably count on one hand the time you see me without being dressed up or a tie, because you didn't see Sam Muchnick out, you know, unless he was just relaxing. But if he was going out representing what he built, he played the part.
Right.
And I'm not saying anything against any of the other promoters who don't do that. Everybody has their own style. And they can call me a copycat, call me what they want. But the one thing that they'll never, ever be able to say is that I don't protect the business. And I'll continue to do that.
How could
Well, so
anybody
given
call
what
you
you've
a
done, you're probably
copycat
one
when
that
you've
they
been?
should copycat.
Hey,
I'm sorry.
I said, given what you've done, you're probably one that they should copycat.
Well, you know, I've got a few, as you guys know, there's a few promoters out there that we work with that I think, and they call and they say they call to pick my brain, and you know, Scotty Z, Searcher, you know, Austin Bayless and I from up in Iowa talk. Troy Peterson from Impact calls. Uh, when my good friend Bert Prentice was alive, you know, him and I was on the phone weekly, um, just talking about the business, you know, um, and that's why, you know, last weekend I was in Fort Leonard Wood, Missouri. I went down with Leland Race, WLW, took Bob Orton down there, and him and I had a discussion. You know, I get accused of not wanting to work with anybody. Well, I'll match who I work with against anybody else out there running. I'm not here to please anybody but the fans and my locker room, and of course my wife and my daughter, who's and my sons, who are the spark behind the knock. You know, it's just I told Leland, I said, you know, I'll work with anybody who wants to work with us. To a certain degree. Now, don't bring me no BS, because if you bring me the BS that some of it's running out there, I don't want to be a part of that. You know, I'm not going to have my locker room go out there and go against guys who aren't properly trained, and that's why we were fortunate to have the Ace Wrestling Academy. And of course, Jim, you know, you're down there and you're doing a hell of a job. And I know Bobby gets to come down there off and on during his work schedule, and we got to get Nate down there one night. He'd have a ball.
Yeah, he would.
Coming down there, we need to have him come down and do a little filming and show the young talent how they get beat up by the big Texan.
Well, so we kind of jumped into things, but I'm going to push us back a little bit. Now, we all know anyone who loves the business started out as fans, you know, because you got to be a fan of the business to actually want to jump into this side of it. And I've always heard that, you know, it was because of Larry that helped you meet Sam. How did you actually meet Larry, though? Larry Matisick is who I'm referencing to. Larry was the announcer or I guess you would say play-by-play guy, but for the Wrestling at the Chase. How did you meet Larry?
Larry's father, Ed, has had the same job that I do now during my day job. He was the director of, back then it was called civil defense director. And of course, as years have went on, they upgraded it from civil defense to ESDA, Emergency Service Disaster Agency, and now it's called EMA. And now the state just in the last week has changed the name to EMA, Office of Homeland Security. So over the years, that's progressed. But Larry's father had that job, and of course, I ran the ambulance company for almost 40 years in the East St. Louis, St. Clair County area. So I got to know his dad through that connection, and of course met Larry. Knew Larry was a household name for many, many years, and him and I shared the common bond of the law enforcement. His dad was actually also the chief of the Belleville, Illinois Police Department Auxiliary. And they was a group of men that would assist the officers at the football games, at the county fair, at special events. And then when his father retired, Larry took that job over. Well, I'd been in law enforcement. I'd worked in Washington Park. I worked for the United States Marshal Service. I was deputized by the FBI. I worked as a police chief in East Carondelet, Illinois, before becoming mayor. So him and I shared that law enforcement bond, and of course the bond, the glue, the thick glue, was the wrestling, and the wrestling was the glue. And he'd invite me to the office when he started. He started for Sam when he was 16 years old. Didn't even have a driver's license. And so when he did get a driver's license and then we started driving to work, he wanted to have a co-pilot. So I would drive over to the right over to the office with him. The first day I ever went in, I'll never forget, Whipper Billy Watson and Gene Kaniski is sitting in the office talking to Sam. And I mean, I'm like a kid at a candy shop. And of course, Larry had already tuned me up and said, look, just go in there and just listen. Because Sam had told us, he said, what you hear and see in the office stays in the office. We had access to all the files. He said, you can go through anything you want to. You just can't, they don't leave the office. Now, here all these years later, I have those files. So, I'd sit there and I'd hear Sam Muchnick talking to Fritz Von Erich on the phone about when he was sending certain talent down to Fritz, or Fritz was sending somebody up to him, or he'd be on the phone with Stu Hart. Gene Kaniski, I loved Gene when he worked, and he was a heck of a prankster. And when he was even in the office, he'd always be razzing Sam. But, just to be able to have that availability to go and do that with Larry. And, of course, Larry in his own right, Larry never per se had a job other than wrestling. A lot of people don't know that. If he did get a job every now and then, he would lose it because they'd want him to work on a Friday night, and he'd say, nope, I'm going to wrestling. That's all there is to it. And his wife, Pat, will tell you that he lost a few of those jobs because of wrestling. And he started writing those articles, and Sam hired him. His first paycheck was $25 that he got from Sam Muchnick. I got a copy of that check.
Oh, wow.
So I mean, but that's how Larry and I met, and they.
Well, Herb, let me cut you off for a second. How old were you when you first met Sam?
When I first met Sam, I had my first show in 1973 that I was promoting, and I had met Sam. I'd actually started promoting independently, as we call it, which I hate that word, but I always told Larry, I said, I want to know more about the behind the scenes, behind the curtains, the promotional part of it, and not just going out and promoting a show, but I wanted to learn the politics of the business, because I'd always been told about how bad it was. So when Larry and I first met Larry, man, I was just still wet behind the ears, basically. I was a little young boy that grew up in the housing projects in East St. Louis, Illinois, watching it on a 12-inch black and white TV with my mom, and my brothers and sisters wasn't nowhere near the fan that my mom and I was. So the wrestling was the glue for me and my mom. We bonded together and watching the wrestling at the Chase, Of course, back then you didn't have a lot to watch. You had wrestling, roller derby, and the Three Stooges. And
good lineup.
We watched all three of them.
There's nothing wrong with all three, though.
Nothing's wrong with all three. No, it wasn't. But, like I said, when Larry and I would go up to Larry's house, and he would be out, where he lives, Jim, or where he lived, right around the corner from you. You spent a few days there. And, but he would be out there on his driveway. He had a basketball hoop out there. And he'd get out there in the afternoon and wintertime, summertime, sweating his tail off, shooting hoops by himself. And he was a cardio fanatic. And then he would go inside and he would make trips up and down his steps. And I mean, I watched him one day, 180 trips up and down the steps. Wow. And I used to fuss at him. Larry, it's bad on your back, it's bad on your knees. And man, he said, yeah, but I got to keep your heart pumping, And of course, as all of us know, that one of the things that really got to bother him later on in life was his legs and his back. And then he would always tell me, I should have listened to you every time you come by. And because I'd drive by in the ambulance, or I'd be leaving Memorial Hospital or one of the Belleville hospitals, and I'd see him out there, and I'd swing in and sit there and talk with him, and he'd say, I should have listened to you because my back and my legs and my neck was just shot, because he ended up getting the spinal stenosis is what actually got him in the wheelchair, and kind of got him in a state to where he couldn't get around.
Well,
So when you ran that first show, did he just kind of turn you loose, or was he? Obviously, he gave you a lot of the knowledge ahead, but did he help you run that first show, or was that just on your own?
Oh yeah, no. I'd run a couple shows on my own. Down in Malden, Missouri was some of the first shows I ran down in that area. But when I really got Larry involved is when I knew I wanted to start expanding. And we started. He hooked me up with guys like Gypsy Joe. Well, first he hooked me up with a guy named Bill Ash, and I know you guys have heard that name. He made probably 99% pair of the boots that the guys wear out there back then. Bill Ash did, and Bill was booking different guys at that time back in the day, and Bill was working himself. And Bill never did work for me, but his son did, and then he sent me guys up like Saul Weinkraft's son, Gypsy Joe, Tojo Yamamoto, Frank Morrell, a few of the other boys from down in that area. But and so then Larry, and then when we got into about let me think here, about late 70s, early 80s is when he introduced me to Frank, Bruiser Brody. And from then, it was just he opened the door to so many of the other guys for me. I mean, the first time I had Frank at Belle Claire Fairgrounds, I'll never forget. I'd been running shows there for probably about a year and a half, 2 years, and we were doing great. But crowds would drop off, and then they'd come back, and we were there one night. You guys have been in the building, of course, and we were standing there, and Larry's kind of looking over my shoulder. And at that time, I had brought in guys from up in Chicago, some from Indianapolis, Sammy Darrow, people like that. That later on ended up running Windy City, Chicago. That's where Ron Powers and a bunch of Gary Jackson, those guys started going back and forth working. But I'll never forget Larry standing there, and he's kind of looking over my shoulder. And we had a good crowd that night, and he asked me, he says, "Hey, what do you think about bringing Frank in here?" And I remember I turned around and looked at him. I said, "Frank ain't coming to Belleville, Illinois." And he said, "You never know." He said, "Let me work on it." And the only night we could run at the fairgrounds back then was a Thursday night, because they had their weekends were always packed with either bingo or dances, weddings, you name it. I could never get it. When I first started running there, they had boxing. Amateur boxing was there. A guy named Lou Meckel ran the Belleville Boxing Club, and the Kunkel boys. And I used to go to the boxing matches there. And then when I started booking the wrestling shows, it took about 8, 9, 10 months. The boxing fans switched to become wrestling fans. We saw a crossover. So
more entertaining.
So the boxing, well, and I don't know if you've ever been to the amateur boxing match, but they would bring prisoners from like Menard Penitentiary, Centralia, and they would have them as doing amateur boxing there.
Wow.
And so, but the crowd switched when I started bringing in, like I said, Gypsy Joe and those type of guys. They ended up shutting the boxing down at the fairgrounds, and they moved to Fisher's Restaurant in Belleville.
Okay.
Because you couldn't compete. They couldn't compete with the crowds that we started drawing. And Larry's relation was a distant cousin. A guy named Glenn Decker used to be the manager of the fairgrounds. So we had an in there. And of course, Glenn was a wrestling fan because of Larry. And so when the boxing left, he said, "Come on now, I'm going to give you a good deal on the building." And so, and it just kind of blossomed from there. A quick story, WWF. I'll never forget, Glenn calls up Larry one day and says, "Hey, I got a guy named Howard Finkel just called." Of course, anybody that's listening to this knows Howard Finkel, great guy. Him and Larry
Right.
was best friends. And Glenn called Larry and said, "Yeah, this guy named Howard Finkel from the WWF called, and they want to rent the building, and they want to do TV shows there." And Larry says, "Well, what'd you tell him?" He said, "I told him we got wrestling here already." And Larry said, "Well, what'd you tell him?" And he said, "This guy joined, so you don't understand. This is Vince McMahon, WWF, Sports Entertainment." He said, "We want to rent that building." And Glenn said, "No, you don't understand. Well, I got somebody we rent to. It's SICW." He says, we will come in there and we will land the helicopter and we'll bring you a suitcase full of money. We want that building." And Glenn Decker said, "Well, you can land here and you can bring your money, but Larry Matysek and Herb Simmons is who we're renting our building to."
Wow, that is crazy.
I always thought that was pretty cool. And
Yeah.
God rest Glenn Decker, because he was at every show that I did there. And the gentleman who just passed away last year, Charlie Todd, he was kind of the caretaker around there, the logistics guy. In fact, he died after one of our shows just there last year. We had that show, and he ended up having a heart attack. But he'd been around there a long, long time too, and they always loved the wrestling. So anyway, Larry gets Brody to call me, and so we make a deal. And keep in mind now, Brody had a reputation of no-showing promoters, and I heard from different people. Dick the Bruiser told me, "You can't trust him; he won't show up." I said, "Oh, okay. That's calling the kettle black." My first encounter with Dick the Bruiser wasn't the best of a good relationship for a while, but what scared me was when I made the deal with Brody. We booked a date. And I told Larry, I said, "Look," I said, "now I'm counting on you to make sure he gets here, because otherwise I'm going to have," we had billboards up and on West Main Street in Belleville. We had newspaper ads in the Metro East Journal newspaper. I went all out. This guy's larger than life at that time on TV. He's coming to Belleville, Illinois, and Herb Simmons is bringing him. So kind of felt pretty good. And so
Right.
the night of the show comes around, and that parking lot is jam packed. We've got over 2,000 people inside that big hall, and so we're waiting, and my wife is taking the tickets at the front door like she always did, and one of our friends from in town here, and it gets to be close to 8 o'clock. It gets to be about 7:30, and I'm thinking, okay. I told Larry what time to be there. Larry was picking him up at the airport, and it gets to be about 7:45, and no Larry, and the crowd is getting a little rambunctious, and to the point where they're doing that Brody, Brody, Brody chant. And so you guys know the building. I'm outside underneath the canopy, right? And I'm watching out the gate. I'm watching my watch, and I'm thinking, what the heck is going to happen? I'm walking back and forth, and my wife comes out the side door, and she says, "Hon, what are we going to do?" And I said, "What are we going to do? You're going to have to go back in there and tell them something, because I'm leaving." It's like 2 minutes to 8. And I look out at the road, like over across towards where McDonald's is. I see the car pulling in, and I said, "Well, is that Larry's car?" And he had an old Buick at that time he was driving. And as he came up the road, I could see it was him. And they pull in underneath the canopy. And God steps out of that car as far as I was concerned. He's got a pair of cut-off shorts on, tennis shoes. He's putting his hair back in the ponytail. And he gets out of that car, and I'm standing there. And back then, I'm a big guy. I'm close to 450 at that time. And he walks up to me and sticks his hand out, and he says, "I bet you didn't think I was coming, did you, big boy?" And I said, "Nah, I never had a worry."
Never had a worry.
So that was actually my first encounter with Frank in person. We talked on the phone a lot, but other than his first match there, and of course he went in. And every time I ever booked him from that point on, whoever it was against, we would be in the locker room, and he'd always say, "What do you want tonight, big boy?" And that always made me feel, here's a guy that's, like I said, larger than life in the fans' eyes and my eyes, because I'm a fan.
Right.
And he's asking me what I want, and I'd say, just send him home happy. And regardless of who it was against, whether it was Murdoch or Blackwell, Butch Reed, whoever, he never or Abby, he never disappointed the fans at all.
And that's kind of shocking that he asked you what you wanted, because when you hear about Frank, Frank always did what was best for him. Yeah, and you hear that a lot about other promoters, like you said, other promoters not really sure about him, and other wrestlers too, because there's stories we told before about Al Snow wrestling Frank, and one we didn't even touch up on was like the Lex Luger and the cage match. Nate, you should YouTube Lex Luger versus Bruiser Brody. because it's a Lex was kind of thrown into the wolves, but they put him at the top as soon as he got into the business. He's an ex-football player. He had great looks, so they threw him up to the top. But he was greener than shit. And you're talking about Bruiser Brody, who he did what he wanted. Right, but they put him in a cage, and Lex tried to do everything he could to him, and Bruiser is just no selling it. And you can just start seeing Lex Luger, his what's the word? When you're overconfident, like you're arrogant. So Lex hadn't been known about being a little arrogant, and then you just see him starting to break. And wondering, what the hell am I going to do? What am I going to do? He's not doing anything. I'm hitting and he's not reacting. And you just start seeing him freak out. And then all of a sudden he just screw it, I'm out of here. And he climbs the cage and leaves.
Did you ever hear the story the referee told about that story, Alphonse? Yeah.
Well, I'm sure I have, but.
He's in there telling, Lex is telling him, what do I do? What do I do? And Alfonso said, I don't know. Don't ask me. I'm not getting involved.
I'm not getting involved.
They threw him in there, and but again, then there was all the rumors that Frank went back and beat the crap out of Lex, and that never did happen. In fact, Frank actually went back and had a nice sit down with Lex, and he knew he was greener than grass, and it was a power play going on back then, and it was a good point you just brought up. Frank was his own man, and that's why I felt so good when he would ask me, because one, whatever his guarantee was, he was always there. When he walked in the door, he didn't have to worry about his money being there, and I was warned about that from Larry. He said, I'm going to tell you all these horror stories that you've heard, and Larry named them. Every one of those promoters tried to screw over him, and then he would get even with them one way or the other. Bruiser was a prime example. I mean, he knocked the hell out of Dick Bruiser in Peoria, Illinois, in the locker room tonight.
Really?
And Spike Huber tell you that story. But it's because Dick, it was a bad house tonight. I'll catch you next time, and Frank, later on when him and I got to become real good friends, I'll say, because I've never said it to anybody other than Barbara, his wife, kind of let the cat out of the bag here. A couple months back, she was doing a podcast, and she had let it be known that Frank and I was getting ready to do a business venture together, and Larry was going to be a part of that. And since then I've had people say, why haven't you ever told that? And I said, because it was nobody's business. I would never say that, but when Barbara let the cat out of the bag, in fact, after we got off the podcast that night, I called her and I said, what are you doing? What are you telling people that for? And she, her response was basically, people need to know that you're keeping Frank's legacy alive, but the friendship was a lot more than just that business part of it, because, like I said, my two of my three dogs, one's called Bruiser, the other one's called Brody. I mean, I could call, and just like we're doing now, him and Larry and I would spend hours and hours on the phone at night talking. And I mean, he taught me so much about, and you've heard me sit around and talk about some of the other promotions and how they do things and how not to get involved with them. That was a lot of that knowledge that he passed on to me, because you got to protect your territory. And that's kind of what I preach. That's why that 25-mile rule that seems to be the hot topic and has been for several years now that I get blamed for.
Well, let me cut you off, because it's actually not. There's no reason why you should get blamed for that, because it's something that us wrestlers, your locker room, come up with that.
Yeah, and some of the guys, if you remember correctly, that aren't with us anymore, wanted it to be 50 miles, and I'm the one that did say, nah, this is 2021 or whenever that was. I remember where we were at. We were out. That's the night I was going to retire, and the guys that was there that night all said, "No, you can't retire," and we just got to move on. And that's when a couple of them said, "Let's make this. Why do we want to let it be 25? Let's make it 50." I said,
Right.
"No." It's like, and the thing that really is complex about that is if the ones that are complained about that and have complained about that, it benefits them.
Yeah.
I'm just trying to show them, spread your wings. And I don't mean spread your wings and fly down the road 10 miles because
Right.
you're performing in front of the same fans. When we talk about road trips, get your butt in that car, go to Chicago, go to Indianapolis, go to Tennessee. One, you're going to get bonding with more of the guys in these other locations. You get to know people. You get to wrestle different people that you know, that you don't know. So it's actually a benefit for them. But, well, Herb just wants to control everything. Well, let me tell you something. If Herb hasn't controlled it for 50 years, now is not the time for me to be thinking about controlling anything. The only thing I want to control is my fans being happy.
The funny thing I feel about the situation is that the ones that are complaining about the 25-mile rule are the ones that are not in the locker room. So, I mean, it's crazy. Us, the ones that are in the locker room, are happy, glad about the 25-mile rule. But as you said, it seems to be a hot topic that keeps coming up and coming up. But it's everyone that's not in the locker room. So, I mean, it's crazy to me that this is even a topic that we got to cover so often.
Yeah. Well,
the people that it actually affects are okay with it.
Yeah, Nate.
In the original territory system, was there a mileage rule that everybody sort of abided by? Unofficial or official?
Yeah, you know what? Promoters would have that, but it was, sometimes it was you had to be 100 miles away. If you went and worked for somebody else and the promoter that was your home base found out about it, you didn't work there no more. And that was pretty well the standard. Hey, you go somewhere now. And when TV wasn't as prevalent before it really got started back there, it was okay. But then when TV started being the TV studios and wrestling promoters were doing that, you had to really be particular because, and that's kind of where we are now. If I've got you on our little quote social media program platform, and we're giving you a push, why would I let you go down the road 10, 15, 25 miles or whatever it may be to another promotion that are going to do just the opposite of what I'm doing with you? If I'm trying to make you this big star and my fans are buying into that, they're going to take you down there for two reasons. One, to discredit you, thinking they'll take fans away from us, or they don't have a care about you anyway. And or third, they don't know what they're doing with it. So, you had to be outside that territorial TV if you were going to do it. And then the promoter had to give you the okay to do it.
Yeah, I think it's just worse now because there is so much social media presence. There is some, you can flip on the internet anywhere and find someone wrestling for someone. But I think the internet is now the worst enemy of professional wrestling, but it's also the benefit. So I mean, it's a yin yang. But
yeah, it's a double-edged sword, is what it is.
yes,
the fans. And believe me, our fans are smart. Some promotions think, oh, they're just this and they're that. No, these wrestling fans are smart. They want to be entertained. And my concern is that the society that we're living in now, with the economical downfalls that everybody goes through, oversaturation is not good.
right.
If that's the case, why don't we have 2 and 3 major baseball teams in the St. Louis area? Why don't we have 2 or 3 major football teams in St. Louis?
Right.
And they can say, oh, well, the NFL won't allow it. Well, guess what? Back in the day, Sam Muchnick didn't allow it.
Yeah.
It was like, if you come to St. Louis, 2 things happen. Either I'm going to bury you or I'm going to show you that you made a big mistake. And he never had to worry about that because everybody took care of their own and they respected one another. You know, you didn't have this having to worry about somebody going out there booking your town because you're drawing a good crowd. And I'll give you an example here a couple of months ago, and Jim, you were over there with me. A gentleman come up and said, "Hey, we're going to run this show over there, and it's in your backyard. We hope you don't mind." Uh, you know, back in the day, there may have been a couple of guys, you know, take really frown on that. But
Oh yeah.
my response to them was real simple. No problem. Just do me the same favor. When you see the SICW poster showing up in your hometown that you claim, don't get upset about it. Because
Right.
when I come, I'm coming with the army. And, and again, I mean, that's not a threat. That's business. I
Yeah.
mean, when we have taken 50 years of, when I've taken 50 years of my life to, and it's not about the money. It's because you guys know there's no money in what we do. It's the passion and the love and the drive we have for the legacy of what the people before us, the Sam Muchnicks, the Larry Matiseks, all the legends have
Right.
built. And I had a guy just tell me today on the radio show, what's going to happen, Herb, when you decide to leave this world? I said, well, I hope that's a long time away. I don't really like to think about that. But, you know, you've heard Ron Powers get in the ring and say that. And
Yeah.
I'm not, he wasn't bragging about that, but he's one of the old timers that knows this. There's nobody's doing it like we do it. And there's
Mhm.
nobody that wants to learn how to do it because it's all about, well, how much money can I get from the fans and put in my pocket and not reinvest in what you're doing? You know, you
Right.
have to do that. You know, it's all about, yeah, let's just run down the road and run against one another, you know, and it shouldn't be that way. But I can't change that. So,
Right. Totally agree. Now you're just like me. We get off on these different subjects, but I want to bring it back down to the fairgrounds and bring it back to Brody and a special person that showed up to one of your shows. I love hearing this story. It was you and Larry, the special referee for a Brody match. Can you tell us that one?
yeah, Luthez, another great guy that I loved. I mean, I first got to meet Luthez back in the mid 60s when I was really a young man at the Social Center
Wow.
in East St. Louis, Illinois, at 9th and Summit Avenue. That's where wrestling in East St. Louis started at. People like him and Cowboy Bob Ellis and a lot of the first timers right there. But Larry and I had the honor of being there at the Belle Fairgrounds, and they were shooting an angle in Japan. And we had the show booked there. And Larry had called me like the night before and said, "Hey, Frank wants to know, can we get in the fairgrounds early tomorrow?" And I said, "Well, yeah, why? Yeah, why?" And he said, "Well," he said, "Luke," and we had Lou booked as a special guest referee there. And he said they'd like to get in there and just mess around a little bit. And I said, "Sure, no problem." And so I meet them up there, and they dress out. And I asked Larry, I said, "What are they doing?" He said, "Well," he said, "they're shooting this angle, and they got a couple of the Japanese photographers here, and they're going to shoot some exhibition match and have it for promos over there." And I said, "You're kidding me." Now, and you guys know how big the fairgrounds is. I mean, here's the ring sitting in there, and at that time we was using an 18 by 18 ring. In fact, it was Chuck Bailey's. I don't know if you guys remember Chuck that used to bring the ring over to South Broadway, but
Yes.
we had his ring at that time. And so Larry and I mean, we're sitting right there, dead center of the ring, and we had our feet up. And there's Luthez and Bruiser Brody. Now, two of the opposites when you stop and think about size. You know,
Right.
technical shooter, hooker, whatever you want to call him, against the biggest brawler of the time back then. And I'm
Right.
thinking to myself, man, oh man, am I the luckiest guy on earth?
Oh
And
yeah.
I even told Larry, I said, I couldn't even have dreamt of that I would ever see that. And I sit there and they rolled around and did reversals, and Fez was showing him how to do some takedowns, some chain wrestling. And I mean, it was probably the best exhibition I've ever seen and witnessed. And the thing that really sticks out in my mind, the two Japanese photographers are running around there, like 100 miles an hour, like that movie Rodan years ago. They're trying to keep up with the big dinosaur. And they'd be over here, and Thez would throw Brody across the mat with an arm drag and be on him and hook his leg and take him down. And I could see Frank's, his expression was worth $1 million, because it was like, holy shit, how's this guy doing to me, And I'll never forget. And this went on for I bet you it was an hour and a half, 2 hours. And he'd stop, and then he would explain, this is how you do it. This is how you do the go behind. And this is how, if a guy don't want to go, this is how you make him go. And and I'm thinking, and Larry is just sitting there too, and of course Larry always had the smile on his face, and he'd look over at me and he'd nod his head, and I'm shocked at what I'm watching. But after it was over with, Lou went over and grabbed a folding chair, put it up against the wall, and did about 150 to 180 push-ups off of that chair after he's been in there rolling around with Bruiser Brody. And I'm thinking,
that's crazy.
And I'll never forget, Larry says, and Frank's taking the tape off of his wrist, and he's going to get dressed out. And Larry says, hey, what was it like rolling around in there with the old man? Frank says, let me tell you something. He says, when he gets a hold of your wrist, it's not if you're going, it's where you're going. He said he had me wrapped up like a pretzel. And I'll never
that would have been amazing to see.
Oh my God. I told Lou's wife, Charlie Thez, she comes up to Waterloo, Iowa every year when we're up there at the Dan Gable Museum in the Lou Thez and Tragus Hall of Fame. I've told her that story, and she just gets a kick out of it and Larry even told her before he passed away about it. But I'll always remember that was you got those highlights of when you do something that's Lou. We're talking Lou Thez. This was
right.
This was a guy that, and I don't know if you've ever read his book or not, but he's got some great stories in that book. And
yeah, I've read that a few times.
I've sat there and watched his matches, though, and you're talking about just how he gets a hold of people and moves. I'll sit there and rewind a spot 4 or 5 times. How did he get from here to here? It doesn't even make sense watching it.
No.
You just got to keep he did this slight little movement here. I can't even imagine.
Well, there was a point in time when the NWA was going to take the title off of Buddy Rogers, and Larry had told me the story, and several other people had too. In fact, Lou had told the story, and Buddy kept dodging it. They'd book him here, they'd have him against one another, and for some reason or other, Rogers wouldn't show up. He had this problem, flight delayed, couldn't get there. And this went on for 3 or 4 months in different locations. And so they book him in a match in Chicago. And they booked Rogers to defend the title against somebody else. Rogers shows up, he's out there doing his strutting and all this stuff, And here comes a guy from the dressing room, and he's got a full robe on with a hood on, and he's walking through the crowd. And he gets up in the ring, and the referee's standing there. He flips his head back, and it's Lou Thez. And he sticks his hand out to Rogers and says, we'll either do this the easy way or the hard way. And he took the knife off of me. So.
Reading his book, it's just crazy the amount of techniques that he had. And, back then, that's all he did. He woke up and then went to the what was it, a sports, what would be the name of it? It's like a boys club, basically. You would go, or a wrestling club, and there would be, 10, 15 people there, and they would all wrestle each other. And there's some times that he would wrestle all 15. And, you want to get them in and out, kind of get them done and over with. So that's why he developed that hooking style. Because if you're going to wrestle 15 people, you want to go through it quick. Get them to tap out, quit, and break a bone there so they won't do it again. But his book, Hooker, is, I can't tell you enough. Anyone out there, I mean, that is a book to read. It goes through his whole life, and I know
Not
we
bad
talked
for
about this.
Yeah, not bad for his dad being a chicken farmer.
Right, right. And, he's a St. Louis legend. It's not like he was, in New York or New Jersey or down in Texas or in Florida. He is our legend. Luthez grew up here. Matter of fact, I'm going to bring it up, but I know that he lived over in St. Louis, and when he passed away, you and Larry got some of his ashes, and you guys put it on the doorstep of where he used to live.
No, another highlight when his wife Charlie asked us to do that. She sent us a box of the ashes, and she wanted them spread at the back of the Kiel Auditorium at the Checker Dome where it used to sit at, and then on Virginia where his house used to be. So we got to go there and sprinkle his ashes on all three of those locations. And you talk about one of those surreal moments when you do that, knowing that you're holding. It was a bag, is what it was, but she had it in a box. But
Right.
when Larry was standing there and he took it out of the box and he handed the bag to me, and I'm not superstitious or whatever you might say, but just to sit there and stand there and say that you're holding part of Luthez in your hand was so real. I mean, it was a moment that another one I won't forget. And
Right.
it was like when we got to walk through the Kiel Auditorium, because that was the same day that we spread the ashes there. The security guard had come out and said, "Hey, what are you guys doing?" Well, of course, right away, he didn't know me from Adam, but he looked, "Hey, you're Larry Matisek." Hey, man, I know you. And Larry says, "Hey, do you think my buddy and I could take a trip through there?" Because they were in the process of, they didn't know if they were going to tear it down or what they were going to do. And one of the biggest mistakes that I made is we're up in the locker room and we're up there out in the arena where the ring set. And we went downstairs, and over in the corner, I saw this big pile of iron and plywood. And I said, "What the heck is that?" And Larry went over there and he said, "Ha, that's the old wrestling ring." And I said, "You got to be kidding me." And the security guard says, "Yeah, they're looking for somebody to haul it out of here. You guys want it?" And of course, at that time, I'm thinking, what the hell would I ever do with that? Now, man, I'll tell you what, you talk about hindsight's foresight.
Right.
I should have went and got a truck and hauled that ring out of there, because that would have been in the museum also. And even though it was the worst ring in the business, anybody would tell you that, the hardest ring in the business and the biggest ring in the business. But they said if you took a bump on that, you had to go to the chiropractor the next day. So, but just to be able to say you had that ring, and I've heard guys on other podcasts say that that ring was down at South Broadway's training gym, and it's like one guy I heard say that the promoter, another location, had Ric Flair walking down the stairways from South Broadway Athletic Club. Well, I hate to disagree, but I did text the guy and say, what type of stuff are you selling? Ric Flair was never at South Broadway Athletic Club, and but again, it's their story. They get to tell it the way they want to.
That's true.